Hello, Lisa, and hello, everyone watching us. Welcome to Tennis Takeaways. I'm Duey Evans, a tennis coach in Austin, Texas, and coach, educator, and advocate for parents in the world of tennis.
And I'm Lisa Stone, creator of Parenting Aces. I'm based in San Clemente, California, and my goal is to help parents navigate through the junior and college tennis journey and to give parents a voice at the table when it comes to junior tennis development and college recruiting. So welcome to the show, everybody. We've got a great one today, Dewey.
I'm looking forward to it. Can you tell us a little bit about our guest?
Yeah, we've got with us today Cecil Harris. Cecil is a journalist and an author based in New York. And I actually had the opportunity to interview Cecil for the Parenting Aces podcast earlier this year when his latest book, Different Strokes, came out. Cecil recently was on a panel at the American Tennis Association week-long series, and I heard him speak again last week, and it kind of triggered this thought that we needed to get him on our show, Dewey, and get back to our conversation around diversity and inclusion, because these are topics that Cecil is intimately familiar with. So I'm thrilled to have him with us today.
Hi, Cecil.
Thank
How
you for
are you?
inviting me. I'm
Yeah.
fine, Dewey. Pleasure to meet you and great to see you again, Lisa.
Great to see you too. Thanks for doing this so last minute.
Oh, you're
So,
welcome.
Cecil, I didn't have a chance to read your book because we just found out, over the weekend that we were going to have you on, but I did get to listen to the podcast that you did with Lisa earlier in the year, and some fascinating information and some places that I think people haven't really dug into a lot, where you seem to really have your finger on the pulse of some places where tennis maybe hasn't done quite as good a job as they advertise, or that we all see that has happened in the world of player development. But there's some other places in tennis that maybe need a little bit of help. What's your thoughts?
Well, that's definitely true. People have been sort of misled indirectly by the success of the Williams sisters. Now, granted, Serena and Venus are the most successful sibling act in sports history, and they have carried the flag for American tennis since the late 1990s. But just because of that, it doesn't mean the revolution is over and blacks have won. The subtitle of my book is Serena, Venus, and the Unfinished Black Tennis Revolution. And that's a reference to other areas in a $5.5 billion a year industry where blacks are severely underrepresented. And one of those areas is umpiring. I mean, the third most important position, if you will, if you're watching a singles match, the person in the high chair officiating the match. And unfortunately, the U.S. Tennis Association has systematically excluded blacks from rising in the umpires' ranks. And when Lisa and I spoke on her Parenting Aces podcast, I mentioned Sandy French, who is still the only African American ever to officiate a U.S. Open singles final. And that was in 1993, 27 years ago. And the following year, when she reported to the U.S. Open, she was demoted. And she was told, you didn't deserve to work that final last year. Instead of encouraging her and letting that match be the springboard for a successful career, which could have taken her to officiating matches at Wimbledon, the US Open, the French Open, the Olympics. Instead, she was demoted. That led to the first of two racial discrimination suits filed against the USTA by black umpires. It's still a problem. And the USTA has somehow managed to influence its TV partners, ESPN and Tennis Channel, to not even bring it up. It's an underreported scandal that 27 years later, we still don't have another African American officiating a U.S. Open final. And we've had many who were qualified. A man named Cecil Hollins was the first African American to earn a gold badge that allows you to officiate any match anywhere in the world. He had that credential, yet he was not allowed to officiate a U.S. Open singles final or semifinal. And when he complained about that, he was basically silenced. Hollins and French were the first to sue the U.S. Tennis Association. They settled out of court. Both signed a non-disclosure agreement, so they cannot speak publicly about what happened. But I interviewed both of them more than a decade ago for a previous tennis book, and the issues are the same. Systematic exclusion by the USTA, a failure to sponsor talented black officials who have a white badge for bronze badge school, then silver badge school, then gold badge school. That's how it works. You have to be sponsored by your country's tennis association, and the USTA consistently fails to do that. Or if you get to the level of a gold badge or a silver badge, you're not promoted, you're not given the opportunities. And that is literally not an issue for Australian umpires in Australia, or French umpires in France, or British umpires at Wimbledon. Only here in the United States is that a problem for black umpires, and that problem persists because of the deafening silence surrounding that issue. That's why I highlight it in the book Different Strokes. I want people to know how the USTA has been really an impediment to black progress in areas other than, well, in areas including what happens on the court. But because of the presence of the Williams sisters, people think everything is fine, and it's far from the case.
Why is it so important to the growth of tennis in the black community to have black officials on the court at these, very visible events?
I think it's a variation of that old saying, Lisa, once you can conceive it, then you can achieve it. I think people need to see it. People need to see a black person in that high chair of authority officiating a major tennis match before that dream becomes real for them. Not enough people got to see Sandy French officiate major tennis matches. She did it once, 27 years ago. Not enough. Well,
and without incident. We should point out, right.
Yes.
It was a clean match.
A clean match. If you don't notice the umpire or the referee, then they've done a fine job. That's the old adage in sports. And Sandy French did her job well. It should have been the springboard for her for a successful career. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. And young black boys and girls don't get to see that, so it doesn't become real to them. I don't believe they go to the US Open thinking, I can become a tennis umpire, because they don't see African Americans in the high chair officiating the matches. Increasingly, they'll see umpires from other countries who are not even identified, but they just can tell, that's a white male or a white female in the chair in charge of the match. They don't see images of themselves in positions of authority.
So, Cecil, do you believe that's a function of we've relegated black African Americans to being athletes, and therefore we're not putting them into those other places in the sport which hold all of the power? The tournament directors see very little African Americans in the coach education field. So do you think it's okay if they see us running and jumping and being athletic, but not yet okay where we're using our minds more?
That's the problem expressed in a nutshell, Dewey. They basically see black people as the athletes, as the foot soldiers, if you will, not the generals. It's a systemic problem. It's systemic racism personified. It's something the USTA can do something about now. It's something they could have done something about years ago. And I found it appalling, frankly, after the world saw the killing of George Floyd by police officers in Minnesota. And so many organizations in sports and in the corporate world put out statements. And the USTA basically said, we have always been committed to diversity. Well, that's not true. They haven't been. And they need to be called out because of that. The USTA could have a program where they're basically encouraging more blacks to get into the sport as coaches, as officials, as tournament directors. James Blake is the only black tournament director currently at the Miami Open. Leslie Allen, a former pro, was a tournament director briefly on the professional level, but the USTA can address that problem overnight by starting a program identifying people who have the skills to be USTA coaches at the highest level. Officials, tournament directors, tournament referees, umpires, lines people. No such program really exists. And if the USTA wanted it to exist, it would exist. Just as the NBA has made strides in encouraging blacks to become referees, there are 2 women full-time referees in the NBA because the NBA addressed that issue after being criticized for many years. There are women officials now in the National Football League. There are more black umpires in Major League Baseball than ever before. because that league has addressed the problem. The USTA would prefer that people not even know about the problem. And when people like me act as gadflies and basically try to prod them into doing the right thing, no progress is made.
See, talk about the media. And you've covered the sport, at least written books about it, and covered in some other ways. I heard you talk about trying to get an interview with Althea Gibson, and you're as a young cub reporter, and how that over time has changed your thinking about the role of the media and how it has helped or hurt African Americans. Do you think there are enough people of color covering it? Is that maybe that part of the issue is there's not enough coverage from the perspective of people that understand what the athletes are going through, what the officials might be trying to break through, how they see it, and it is covered from a traditional point of view too much.
It is a problem, and that issue of lack of media people of color speaks more toward the media industry, sports editors at newspapers and magazines not assigning Black people to cover tennis, sports directors, assignment editors at networks not assigning enough Black people to cover the sport. And that's a problem when you have this sort of groupthink, everyone approaching it from the same perspective and really having the same sort of implicit bias toward the sport. If you don't believe it's a problem that there aren't enough Black umpires or Black coaches or Black tournament directors, then you're not going to write about it or talk about it. You don't perceive it as a problem. And athletes can be discussed, talked about, written about in stereotypical terms if everyone's coming at it from the same perspective. I'll give you an example. Around the turn of the century, Martina Hingis was #1 in women's tennis. And she was always praised for her court intelligence, her tennis IQ, her ability to think her way through a match and strategize and attack opponents' weaknesses. Well, gradually Venus and then Serena Williams took over, and they became the two best players in the world. And suddenly the narrative was about the physicality of the Williams sisters, the athletic ability of the Williams sisters. I heard them often described as natural players. And I mean, you're Coach Duey, you know as well as there's no such thing as a natural player. You have to learn the strokes. You have to learn the grips. You have to master the skills of the sport. You don't just get out of bed and become a great tennis player. But that whole narrative changed once two Black girls were the best players in the world. Oh, athleticism, physicality, as opposed to tennis IQ. That's an issue when there's a lack of people of color writing about the sport, broadcasting the sport. As recently as 2018, I covered the U.S. Open for the New York Daily News here in New York, obviously, where the U.S. Open is played every year. And there weren't many Black people covering the U.S. Open. There were so many reporters from other countries, and one from Australia who I had met earlier that year when I went to the Australian Open to do interviews for the book. And he said to me he was surprised that he didn't see more Black journalists at the U.S. Open. And I said, well, they're probably doing baseball, or when the NBA season starts next month, they'll be doing the NBA. That's because of segregation in the media industry. I don't blame that on tennis. That's more the function of sports editors and assignment editors not saying, oh, you're Black, I'm putting you on basketball. I'm putting you on football. I'm not assigning you to tennis because Black people don't play tennis in significant numbers. That's also part of the problem.
But it all works together, right, Cecil? Because as we saw when we had Sloane Stephens and Madison Keys in the U.S. Open women's singles final, the two announcers on TV calling the match were white. It was an incredible missed opportunity for the television media to bring in a Leslie Allen, a Chanda Rubin, a Zena Garrison, anyone, of color that was also female. They could have killed two birds with one stone there and made so many people so happy. But instead, you had the two Chris's calling the match.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Lisa, that the ESPN call with Chris Fowler and Chris Everett. Also, Tennis Channel did their own call with Mary Carrillo and Lindsay Davenport. Again, Chanda Rubin works for Tennis Channel. They didn't put her on the match. James Blake works for Tennis Channel. They didn't put him on the match. There was no Black perspective on the historic aspect of two Black women, not named Williams, playing in a major final. And that's a great opportunity lost. And that is consistently the problem. I interview Mal Washington for my book. Not only is Mal the last African American man to play for a major title when he was in the Wimbledon final in 1996, but he then did commentary for CBS, ESPN, and Tennis Channel before he decided to concentrate on his real estate interests in the Jacksonville area. But Mal explains the sport very well, has the insights of someone who has played at the highest level, knows what these players are feeling, knows what it's like when you're facing break point and the match is on the line, and he could articulate that. But he was not someone who the network said, well, Mal, we'll work it out so you can still do your real estate, but you can continue to work for us. The way the McEnroe brothers do so many other things and still find time to do commentary on all the majors. Yeah. No one's saying either or. But with Mal, he got the sense that, I'm not getting enough work on the network level, so let me concentrate on something that I enjoy more. And it's unfortunate that his voice was lost. So there are opportunities to bring more Black commentators on the air. And frankly, if you look at the ESPN stable, last year for the first time they used Alexandra Stevenson, but not on too many matches. She's the only person of color they have on their roster right now. And as I said, Tennis Channel has Chanda Rubin, James Blake, and Katrina Adams again, but they're not using them on enough of the matches. So people can hear a different perspective, and let's say young, Black, aspiring broadcasters can see people who resemble them on a broadcast, and the dream becomes more real for them.
Or even for players coming off the tour. Sorry, Duey, but for players coming off the tour who are looking for that next opportunity, broadcasting is a great one, but maybe they don't see that. Sorry, Duey, go ahead.
I'm actually going to take it in a slightly different direction and say I don't think it should just be open to those people who have played the game, that there are color analysts, that there are the Chris Fowlers of the world who didn't play. Why aren't we seeing people of color put into those roles also? And why aren't we seeing more journalists? And why aren't we seeing more tournament directors? And why aren't we seeing more people in different roles other than athletes? And maybe we need to do a better job of letting young people know, and this probably goes across the board, not just to people of color, but that there are jobs within the sport of tennis other than being a tennis player. And that a young person might really aspire to if they knew that they were there, but we don't ever try to be something that we don't know exists, right?
That's correct. I mean, as I pointed out, tennis is a $5.5 billion a year industry, and the vast majority of tennis jobs have nothing to do with hitting a ball. And if the USTA were to make that better known, then they would have more, let's say, internship programs to introduce young people of color to these other opportunities in marketing and communications and so many aspects of the sport that have nothing to do with actually playing the sport. And I mentioned that in my book, so I hope more people will read that and basically join the effort to pressure the USTA, goad the USTA into letting more people know that it's not just about what happens on court, it's about growing the sport and making it more diverse and inclusive. You have a Black person here, a Black person there, that's really not diversity if they don't feel empowered to speak up about what they're experiencing. And I bring that up because after the first racial discrimination lawsuit against the USTA, one of the recommendations by the New York State Attorney General was to hire a head of diversity. The USTA didn't have one prior to a decade ago. Tony Nimmons took that job. Nimmons was also a Black umpire who had a silver badge and was spending more than 200 days a year on the road officiating matches. But they also made him the head of diversity. They gave him too many jobs, basically, spread it too thin, but he took the job seriously. And when a Black female employee of the USTA reported that a vendor put a noose on her desk, she reported it to him. He took it to the USTA, and they basically blew it off and did nothing. So he had the position, but he didn't have the power where when he said, we have to change this, it changed. We have to stop doing this, it stopped. we need to do this, they started doing it. Instead, the opposite happened, and he ended up being fired in 2016, and he filed the second racial discrimination lawsuit. So you know your association has a problem if you hire someone and put that person in charge of diversity and inclusion, and he ends up suing you for racial discrimination.
Yeah. Yeah, that's ironic. But there, as you mentioned, and I don't want to make light of what you're talking about, but also one of the things Duey and I have been committed to is not only educating our audience, but also leaving the audience with some concrete suggestions of things that can happen, or for, hopefully if USTA is watching this, maybe some concrete ideas of things they can do. And like you said, educating about the different opportunities, besides being a professional tennis player. But there's a huge tennis industry, as you alluded to, Cecil. Companies like Wilson, like Penn, like Babolat, like Adidas, like Nike, that have tennis specific departments and areas of their companies, and have sales reps, have player reps. I know coming up through junior tennis, you see reps from all these companies trying to get the young juniors, hooked on their products so that they have more representation out in the field. So there are tons of opportunities, not just on TV, not just in the print media, not just on the tennis court, not just in the coaching arena, but also in the business world.
That is so true. And unfortunately, Lisa, I think the USTA is going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming into doing it, because I refer again to the statement they put out when all the corporations felt compelled to put out a statement about the horrific killing of George Floyd. And the USTA put out a tone-deaf statement that completely misrepresented what they do and what they don't do. I mean, I think they know, if they take a look at what other sports are doing, what they need to do to make tennis more diverse and inclusive. They're just not doing it beyond a tennis is for everyone ad campaign where they show Sloane Stephens and Frances Tiafoe and Madison Keys. But that doesn't do anything to grow the sport, really.
So, Cecil, are we making a mistake in believing that the United States Tennis Association is the panacea for all of the ills which are upon us? I know that you were doing some things with the American Tennis Association. Mm-hmm. So is there a role for the ATA in providing these opportunities and maybe being a training ground? I hate to call the ATA, the oldest African-American sports organization, a minor league, but is there an opportunity to develop a series of tournaments and better media coverage, that we lost Black Tennis Magazine. So is there an opportunity for people to step into those roles to create and to prove themselves? And then maybe, because how the USTA does things, even with Caucasians, is they let people pilot programs, and then when the program looks like it's successful, they adopt it. That is how they do it. And so do we need to find ways in the Black community of piloting some things ourselves, showing that they're successful, and then maybe the USTA will take it on, but will be on our terms rather than on their terms?
That is something that the ATA is working on. In the seminar I appeared on last week, another panelist, Dr. Dale Caldwell, who used to be the president of the USTA Eastern section, the first and only African-American president of that section, he left after 2 years because his suggestions, frankly, were not being followed, and they should have been. So now he's working with the ATA on developing programs. So there's basically a talent database that the ATA can take to the USTA. And I mention the USTA as often as I do because, like it or not, they are still the national governing body of tennis in the US, and they have to be prodded to do the right thing. So the ATA is working on lists of talented people who can fill some of the slots that traditionally people of color have excluded from. Talented coaches, umpires, tournament referees, tournament directors, marketers, communicators, graphic artists, webmasters, you name it. The ATA is working on developing lists of talented people that they can take to not only the USTA, but to the various tournaments around the country. employ these people at the Pacific Life Open out in California, employ these people at the Miami Open, employ these in Charleston, South Carolina, the various events around the country where you need talented people, and they tend to all look the same, and there's not enough diversity on the circuit in the United States. And yes, there is a need for minor league tennis in America, because we're seeing at the top a desire to try to cut off the world rankings at 300. We all know there are many more than 300 talented tennis players, but if tennis has its way, they'd like to limit the sport to just 300 players. Where is everyone else supposed to go? There need to be opportunities.
So I'm going to, here's where I jump in, and here's where Lisa and I I don't want to say we part company, because we don't have a part company, but she is very much a traditionalist and for the sport, and I very much believe the sport is boring as the day is long. But there is an opportunity for a different product to come to light, which is more, can be groomed in the Black community. There's a reason that people like watching Gail Monfils more than they like watching Roger Federer
Richard
to some degree. Richard Gasquet. And it's because it's exciting, right? He is a showman. And I believe there's a real opportunity to create a show which is tennis, which will bring more people in, which will create that renaissance. And I think not lost on me that tennis was most exciting and was growing the fastest in the U.S. when there were the greatest personalities and rivalries, and McEnroe being, out of control, and Connors being a bad boy, and Vitas Gerulaitis having all the personality and life in the world. And it all got dumbed down to a degree when we started teaching players that you had to control your emotions and not show your opponent things. And we created a bunch of Bjorn Borgs, right, and Chris Everts of the world, which were great when tennis was going strong. But now that tennis isn't going strong, we're not bringing new people in, because who wants to watch it, right? And I think that that's where we're missing it, is that we're trying to conform to a product that, to me, is a dying product, as opposed to we're finding ways to create a new product, bring something new to the table. And I don't know, what are your thoughts? Which side are you on? I guess Lisa's to your left and I'm to your right.
No offense, either way.
I devote a chapter in Different Strokes to Dr. Dale Caldwell and his efforts to try to create what he wants to call a People Up Tour, where there would be tournaments around the country for talented players who are not in the top 300, but entertain and inspire young people to want to play the sport. And he has ideas about starting in the East, because he's based in New Jersey, but then into the Midwest, the South, the North, the West, and have tennis tournaments where the people are, because most people can't afford tickets to the U.S. Open. They're not necessarily going to get on a plane and come to New York when it's healthy to do so. Especially now, they're not going to do it. So bringing tennis to the people is one of his proposals. I devote a chapter to that, to give him the opportunity to let everyone know that that's what tennis needs. I agree with you. The sport was a lot more exciting back in the day. I mean, I used to love to watch Yannick Noah make the shot with his back to the net between his legs on the dead run. He was doing that back in the 1980s. When you see Federer do it, announcers, again, act like they've never seen it before. And maybe those particular announcers who come from football, like Chris Fowler, maybe they hadn't seen it before. But it's been done. And there's a chance for more excitement to come into the sport, more personality, more flair. Players had, I am more inclined to agree with you on this point, Duey, that we need to see more diversity in terms of playing styles, and that will excite more people to watch the sport.
Yet, Nick Kyrgios gets bad-mouthed, when he does his thing on court.
Not cursing, as long as he's not hitting a ball at an umpire, and they all know that there's a boom microphone at courtside. So if you curse, millions of people are going to hear it. As long as Nick stops doing that, just give us the unique flair of Nick Kyrgios, and that's plenty. I mean, I have no problem with Serena yelling, come on, and pumping her fist. Some people do. Why? That's her
Yeah.
Yeah,
personality. Let it
I
show.
will tell you that I live with someone who was a sports fan but had never been really a tennis fan. And when we first went to our first tennis match together to watch someone that I was coaching, player won a point, long, exciting point, but the other person made an error, right? And she was all excited for this person, and she wanted clapping, and I have to say I was immediately like, no, 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 you don't clap for errors, and you don't do, and like
Yeah.
she was like, okay, and we'll sit on my hands, and
Mm.
how boring was that? And there is no other sport where you're encouraged to sit on your hands. And it's why Davis Cup in other countries is so exciting because the crowd's just going wild. There is truly a home court advantage. When I was coaching a young man trying to play on the tour, and he was, as he said, he might be the most athletic tennis person ever, but he wasn't even the best athlete in his hood. But we would do things on fun days, and he would work on, at the time, we're from Boston, and D Brown had won the slam dunk contest doing this 360 no look dunk.
All right. I remember.
And at the time, Pete Sampras was, hitting the air Sampras overheads. Well, we would practice hitting 360 no-look air Samprases. He wanted to actually take off at the service line, hit an overhead, and land on the other side of the net. And I had to really explain to him that you realize the net's still 3 feet high after you've traveled that distance. It's not like there's nothing there and you just land on the ground. But that was the kind of thing that could have been brought to the tennis court, and I think can still be brought to the tennis court. And people would ooh and ah, and the announcers will say, the person's not a purist, and they're not this, and they're not, and they don't want to win. But if it brings more money to the sport, then maybe there are more than 300 paying jobs, right? We're not cutting the rankings off at 300.
Yeah.
There's 3,000 jobs.
That's it.
So
Yeah, those players with flair bring more eyeballs to the TV set. I mean, just as you say, Gael Monfils and Richard Gasquet, both Frenchmen, and Monfils is infinitely more exciting. And if tennis had more Monfils, the sport would have higher ratings, more interest, and would inspire more people to want to pick up a racket and play the sport.
Agreed. Well, with that, we are at 32 minutes, so we are well over our time allotment. So I'm going to be the bad guy and wrap things up here. Cecil, thank you so much for joining us. It has been enlightening. And Duey, I'm going to just kind of...
If people wanted to know more about you, Cecil, or find your book, can you give us some information that people could find here and we can maybe put down in the comments?
Yes, thank you. The book is available at any website with an online presence, but I tend to point people toward bookshop.org. It's a consortium of independent booksellers. And during this COVID-19 pandemic, small businesses, independent businesses are really being hurt these days. So I encourage people to go to bookshop.org, or you could also go to Amazon and order the book that way. And I do have a website, cecilharrisbooks.com. The book is not sold on my website, but they can find out more about me if they go there. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And so just to tee up where we're headed next week, Duey, do you want to go ahead and give us that
next
one?
week we're gonna talk about the importance of parent education in the sport of tennis. That we have coach education, which is much more prevalent in other countries than it is here, but coaches still get education. We have coaching for players. The most important part of that parent-player-coach triumvirate really is the parent. Without the parent, there are no players. You are the bill payers. You are essentially the captain of the team for your player, and you fly blind, and being a parent is hard. It doesn't come with a manual. Being a tennis parent doesn't come with one either, but there is education that's available. We're going to talk about that next week. I look forward to it, Lisa.
Me too. It's right in my wheelhouse, so I look very forward to it as well. For all of you that tuned in today, thank you so much. And if you have comments, questions, suggestions for us, you can reach us via email. I am Lisa@parentingaces.com. Duey is DeweyEvans@gmail.com. Easy peasy. please reach out. We love hearing from our viewers. And for now, Duey, thanks. Everybody have a great week, and we'll see you next Wednesday on Tennis Takeaways.
See you then.